The morning sun rose over what used to be Denver, but Jake Morrison did not have time to watch it. He stood on the metal platform of the watchtower and looked through his old binoculars at the valley below where 300 people lived in buildings made from car parts and concrete blocks. The air still tasted like dust and metal even after all these years, but people had learned to live with it. Jake was 35 years old and had been the commander of this place for 8 years since. The old commander died from lung sickness. His uniform was patched in 12 places, and his boots had holes, but he kept them clean because people needed to see that someone was still in charge. The world had ended slowly, and then all at once, but humans were still here. Amy Chung climbed up the ladder to the platform, carrying a steaming cup of coffee made from chicory and tree bark. She was 29 and could fix anything with wires or circuits, which made her the most important person in the settlement after Jake. Her black hair was tied back with a piece of copper wire, and her coveralls were stained with oil, but her smile was real. "Radio is working again," she said, and handed him the cup. "Got 3 messages from the Kansas group, and 1 from what might be Texas, but the signal was weak." Jake took the coffee and felt the warmth spread through his fingers. Coffee was one of the things they missed most from before, but Amy always found ways to make something that tasted close enough. The radio was built from parts of 6 different machines and should not work at all, but Amy had a gift for making impossible things possible. "Any word from the coastal settlements?" Jake asked. "Nothing for 2 weeks," Amy said, and her smile faded a little. Could be weather, or it could be raiders, or it could be they just finally gave up. Jake nodded and tried not to think about the settlements that had gone quiet over the years. Some had been overrun by the wild animals that came back when the cities emptied. Some had run out of food or clean water. Some had just decided that surviving was too hard and had walked into the wasteland to let nature take them back. The settlement in Colorado had lasted because they had found ways to grow food in soil that should not grow anything, and because they had learned to work together instead of fighting each other. Jake had made rules that were simple and fair, and Amy had made machines that turned garbage into useful things. Dear Lisa Park had kept people healthy with medicine made from plants. And hope. It was not a good life, but it was life. Jake was about to go back down the ladder when Amy grabbed his arm. Her face had gone pale, and she was pointing at the sky above the eastern mountains. Jake raised his binoculars and felt his heart stop. Ships hung in the air like impossible dreams made of silver and light. They were bigger than the old passenger. Jets in shape like teardrops with surfaces that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. There were dozens of them, and they moved without making any sound at all. "Get everyone to the bunkers," Jake said, but his voice came out as a whisper. Amy was already moving toward the ladder, but she stopped when the air around them began to hum with a sound like singing. Every radio in the settlement came alive at the same time, with voices speaking in perfect English, but with an accent that sounded like music. "Greetings, humans," the voice said. "We are the Valari. We have come to save your dying world." Jake felt Amy's hand find his arm again and squeeze tight. Neither of them moved as the ships descended toward the settlement with grace that made them look like they were dancing. The morning sun caught their surfaces and threw rainbows across the dusty ground where children had been playing just minutes before. The larger ship settled onto the flat area outside the settlement gates without disturbing so much as a pebble. A section of its side simply disappeared, and 3 figures stepped out onto the ground. They were tall and thin with pale blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Their faces were almost human, but their eyes were too large and too dark, and their fingers were too long. The one in front wore robes that shifted color like oil on water and moved with a grace that made Jake think of dancers or priests. It spoke. Jake could hear the voice in his head as well as in his ears. "I am High Commander Zephyr," the being said. "We have watched your world die and your people suffer. We offer our help to heal the damage and restore what was lost. You need not fear us, for we come in peace." Jake climbed down from the watchtower with Amy close behind him. His hand rested on the grip of his pistol, but he knew it would be useless against beings who could cross space between stars. The settlement had protocols for many things, but not for this. As he walked toward the gate to meet beings from another world, Jake noticed something that made him pause. The tall, graceful alien was beautiful and spoke of healing and peace, but his hands were shaking. 3 weeks had passed since the Velari ships landed, and the settlement had changed in ways that seemed impossible. The air tasted cleaner, and the water from the well ran clear instead of brown. Plants that had been dead for years were growing green shoots, and the radiation counter that the Elisa Park carried no longer clicked constantly. Jake stood in what the Velari called their command center, which was really just a tent made of material that looked like liquid starlight. Through the walls, he could see the aliens working on machines that hummed and glowed and did things he did not understand. High Commander Zethar had explained that they were atmospheric processors and soil regenerators, but Jake was more interested in watching the aliens themselves. They worked without stopping and barely seemed to eat or sleep. When they thought no humans were watching, their movements became jerky and desperate, like animals that knew predators were hunting them. Their large dark eyes darted to every shadow, and their long fingers trembled when they touched their equipment. Amy appeared beside him carrying a tablet made of the same strange material as the tent walls. The Velari had given her access to some of their technical databases, and she had been studying their machines for days without understanding how any of it actually worked. The power readings are all wrong, she said quietly, so the nearby aliens could not hear. Their ships are running on emergency batteries, and their big machines are held together with patches and quick fixes. This is not the technology of a species that travels between stars to save other worlds. Jake nodded and watched Zethar direct 2 other Velari in setting up another atmospheric processor. The High Commander moved with grace, but there was something frantic in the way she gestured and the way she kept looking at the sky as if expecting something terrible to appear. Dr. Lisa Park joined them, and her face was troubled. She carried a medical scanner that she had been using to check on the Velari, who had collapsed from exhaustion while working on the water purification system. 3 of them had simply fallen over and been carried away by their companions who would not let her examine them properly. I finally got close enough to scan one of them, she said. Their biology is a mess. Stress hormones off the charts and signs of chronic malnutrition. Whatever these people are running from, they have been running for a long time. Amy looked at her tablet and frowned. I intercepted part of a transmission yesterday, she said. Could not translate most of it, but I caught a few words that sounded like hunter and sanctuary and the word for run or flee. Jake felt a cold feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Velari had been on Earth for 3 weeks and had done amazing things to help the settlement, but they had never explained why Earth needed saving or why they had chosen this particular world out of billions of others. Ryan Torres came running across the settlement square with his radio equipment bouncing on his back. He was 26 and had been a communications specialist in the old army before the world ended. His gift was finding signals in static and making sense of patterns that other people miss. Commander, he called out, you need to hear this. He set up his equipment and adjusted several dials until a faint signal came through the speakers. The voices were speaking in the musical language of the Velari, but Ryan had been recording their transmissions and building a translation program. The words keep repeating, Ryan said. Hunter closing in, and nowhere left to run, and something that might mean last sanctuary compromise. Jake looked at Amy and Dr. Park and saw his own fears reflected in their faces. The Velari had not come to save Earth from dying. They had come to Earth because they were dying themselves and needed somewhere to hide. High Commander Zethara approached their group with 2 other Velari following behind her. Her robe shifted from blue to deep purple, and her large eyes seemed sadder than usual. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its musical quality. Commander Morrison, she said, we must speak privately about matters of great importance. Jake followed her away from the others to a place where the settlement walls met the old highway. The Velari ships were visible in the distance, like silver tears falling from heaven. Ithara stood silently for a long moment, and then her shoulders sagged as if she was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "We have not told you the complete truth," she said finally. "We did not come to your world because it was dying. We came because we are dying." Jake said nothing and waited for her to continue. He had learned that sometimes silence was the best way to get people to tell the truth. "Our homeworld was consumed 3 months ago," Zethara said, and her voice became barely a whisper. "An ancient race of machines that devours all biological life found us despite all our efforts to hide. We are all that remains of the Velari people, and we have been fleeing ever since." She turned to face him, and Jake could see tears on her pale blue cheeks. "We chose your world not because it needed saving, but because it appeared worthless to the devourers. A dying planet with primitive technology would not attract their attention. We thought we could help you while we hid among you." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but also something that might have been understanding. "So you lied to us," he said. "We told ourselves it was not a lie," Zethara replied. "We genuinely wish to help your people. But yes, we came here to save ourselves, not you." Jake looked back toward the settlement where humans and Velari were working side by side to repair machines and tend to the growing plants. Children from both species were playing together in the pool, clean water that flowed from the alien purifiers. "What happens when these devourers find you here?" Zethara closed her eyes. "Then your world dies with ours." The meeting hall had never been so full or so angry. Jake stood at the front of the room, made from shipping containers, and tried to keep order as humans and Velari shouted at each other in 2 different languages. 3 days had passed since. Ithara told him the truth, and word had spread through both communities like wildfire. Carl Bennett stood up from his seat near the back. He was the settlement's chief engineer and had been working with Velari technicians to understand their machines. His face was red with anger, and his voice carried over the noise. "They used us," he said. "We opened our homes to them, and they brought death to our doorstep." Several humans nodded and voiced agreement. On the other side of the room, War Chief Kethel rose to his feet. He was younger than Zethara, and his robes were darker with patterns that looked like weapons. When he spoke, his accent was heavier, and his tone was cold. "We should have taken what we needed from these primitives instead of asking," he said. Their world was already dying. "We could have saved ourselves the trouble of pretending to care." Amy Chun jumped up from her chair. "Primitives," she said, "your fancy ships are held together with space junk and prayers. Without our help, half your machines would have stopped working by now." Jake raised his hand for silence, but the shouting continued. D.A. Lisa Park was trying to calm a group of human mothers who were demanding that the aliens leave immediately. Several Velari were backing toward the exits, as if they expected to be attacked at any moment. The noise stopped suddenly when a small voice spoke from the doorway. "Why is everyone so mad?" A human girl named Katie, who was maybe 8 years old, stood holding hands with a young Velari whose name Jake could not pronounce. They had been playing together every day since the aliens arrived and had learned to communicate in a mixture of English and Velari words. Jake looked at the 2 children and felt something shift in his chest. The anger was still there, but underneath, it was something else. The Velari had lied, but they had also saved lives. The atmospheric processors were still working, and the water was still clean, and plants were still growing in soil that had been dead for decades. "Sit down, everyone," Jake said, and this time his voice carried the authority that had kept the settlement alive for 8 years. "We need to figure out what happens next." Amy was the first to speak when the room grew quiet. "I have been working with their technology for weeks," she said. "It is amazing, but it is also fragile. Everything they build is designed to work perfectly under perfect conditions. When something breaks, they replace it instead of fixing it." Carl Bennett nodded reluctantly. Their atmospheric processor failed yesterday, and they were ready to throw it away. I fixed it with some wire and a part from an old car battery. Made it work better than before. Dr. Park stood up. Their medical knowledge is centuries ahead of ours, but they have forgotten how to deal with trauma and stress. They have been running scared for so long that they cannot think clearly anymore. Jake looked at Zethara, who had been sitting silently through the entire meeting. How long before these devourers find you here? He asked. Days or weeks, she replied. Their scout ships are already at the edge of your solar system. The main fleet will follow once they confirm we are here. War Chief Keffel made a sound of disgust. We should leave now and find another hiding place, he said. Where? Jake asked. How many worlds have you tried to hide on? How many times have you run away? Keffel did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. Jake stood up and walked to the center of the room where everyone could see him. I have a different idea, he said. Instead of running or fighting each other, maybe we should work together. The room erupted in voices again, but Jake continued speaking. You have technology we need, and we have something you have forgotten. We know how to fight. Amy nodded and stood beside him. Human engineering is different from yours, she said to the Velari. We build things to last, and we fix things that break. Your machines work better when we combine our approaches. Dr. Park joined them. And your people need to remember how to hope instead of just survive. Humans are good at hope even when things look impossible. Carl Bennett was quiet for a moment, then stood up. I have been thinking about your ships, he said to Zethara. They are fast and powerful, but they are not built for fighting. What if we change that? The Devourers have consumed 1,000 worlds, Keffel said. No one has ever defeated them in battle. Jake smiled, and it was not a nice smile. No one has ever had humans helping them before. Ryan Torres had been quiet through the entire meeting, but now he raised his hand. I have been listening to their transmissions, he said. The Devourers communicate on predictable frequencies using logical patterns. I think we could jam their signals, or even send false information. Zethara looked around the room at the faces of humans and Velari. You would fight for us even though we lied to you, she asked. We would fight for us, Jake corrected. This is our world now. All of us. Amy pulled out her tablet and activated a holographic display that showed the solar system with small red dots moving inward from the outer planets. If we are going to do this, we need to start now, she said. I can modify your ships, but I will need human materials and Velari power sources. Carl Bennett grinned. I have been wanting to take apart one of those atmospheric processors to see how it really works. Dr. Park looked at the Velari in the room. And we need to teach your people how to fight instead of just run. Fear is useful, but courage is better. Jake looked at Zethar and held out his hand. Partners, he said. She looked at his hand for a moment, then reached out with her long fingers and grasped it. Partners, she agreed. The meeting hall was still full of voices, but now they were planning instead of arguing. Humans and Velari were already forming groups to work on different projects. Jake watched them and felt something he had not felt since before the world ended. He felt hope. The workshop that Amy had built from airplane parts, and hope now hummed with energy that made the air taste like lightning. Human tools lay scattered next to Velari devices that glowed with their own light. She stood over a workbench where the impossible was becoming possible, one wire at a time. Jake watched her connect a car battery to something that looked like a crystal made of starlight. When the connection was complete, the crystal pulsed and the lights in the workshop grew brighter. Amy grinned and wiped grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades. The power coupling is holding, she said. Human electrical systems are crude, but they are stable. Velari energy flows are elegant, but they fluctuate. Together they balance each other out. Yithren stood beside her holding a device that translated her words into musical tones for the other Velari workers. He was young for his species, with pale green skin instead of blue, and he had learned to understand human cursing, which Amy used frequently when machines did not cooperate. Your people build as if the universe wants to help them, Yifrin said, in his careful English. My people build as if the universe wants to destroy everything. Perhaps both approaches have merit. Carl Bennett emerged from underneath a Velari fighter ship with oil in his hair and satisfaction on his face. The ship was half the size it had been when he started working on it, but now it bristled with weapons that had never existed before. Human missile pods sat next to Velari, energy cannons, and the whole thing was held together with welds that would have made his old supervisor cry. She will not win any beauty contest, Carl said, but she will punch holes in things that need holes punched in them. Jake left the workshop and walked across the settlement to where Captain Steve Rodriguez was teaching Velari warriors how to think like predators instead of prey. Steve had been a Marine before the world ended and still carried himself like he was ready to fight anyone or anything that threatened his people. The Velari stood in formation holding weapons that looked like musical instruments made of light. They moved with grace and precision, but there was something missing from their movements. They looked like dancers performing a routine instead of fighters preparing for war. Stop, Steve called out. You are thinking too much. Fighting is not about perfect form. It is about staying alive long enough to kill the other guy. War Chief Keffel stepped forward. He was the best fighter among the Velari, but even he moved like he was afraid of making mistakes. We have trained for centuries in the combat arts, he said. Combat arts? Steve repeated and shook his head. This is not art, this is survival. When the Devourers come, they will not care about your perfect technique. Jake approached the training area, and Steve nodded to him. The two men had served together in the old army and could communicate with looks when words were not enough. Steve's look said that the Velari were brave, but they had forgotten how to be ruthless. Show them the knife drill, Jake said. Steve smiled. And it was the smile he used before he did something that would probably get him in trouble. He drew a combat knife from his belt and faced Keffel, who was holding his energy weapon with both hands. Attack me, Steve said. Keffel moved forward with flowing steps and precise strikes that would have been beautiful to watch if they had been dance moves. Steve did not try to match his grace. He simply stepped aside and put the knife against Keffel's throat. You fight like you expect your enemy to follow rules, Steve said. The Devourers do not follow rules. They just kill. Keffel touched his throat where the knife had been, and his large eyes grew wider. You moved without pattern, he said. How do I defend against something that has no pattern? You do not defend, Steve replied. You attack first and you attack to kill. Dr. Lisa Park was working in the medical tent with 3 Velari healers who were learning human field medicine. The tent smelled of antiseptic and the herbs she used to make painkillers from local plants. Her patients were mostly humans who had hurt themselves working with alien technology, and Velari who had collapsed from exhaustion. Jake found her stitching up a cut on the arm of a human mechanic who had gotten too close to a Velari power coupling. The man was conscious and making jokes about his new scar while Dr. Park worked with steady hands. How are our alien friends doing? Jake asked. Better, Dr. Park replied without looking up from her work. I have been giving them human vitamins and teaching them meditation techniques. They are starting to remember how to relax instead of just running on adrenaline. A young Velari healer named Sithar approached with a tablet full of medical data. The stress hormones in our blood are decreasing, she said. Being around humans who are not afraid seems to be contagious. Jake nodded and moved to the communications tent where Ryan Torres sat surrounded by radio equipment and computers that should not have been able to work together. Ryan had been monitoring Devourer transmissions and building a picture of how the mechanical race operated. Any word from our uninvited guests? Jake asked Ryan, adjusted several dials, and pointed to a point. Displays showing signal patterns. They are still at the edge of the solar system, but they are moving closer. I estimate 3 days before they arrive in force. What have you learned about them? They communicate using pure logic with no emotion or creativity, Ryan said. Everything they do follows mathematical patterns. That might be their weakness, Jake looked at the display showing the approaching enemy ships. Each dot represented a vessel capable of destroying entire cities, but he felt no fear. The settlement had survived raiders and radiation storms and winters that should have killed them all. They would survive this. Amy appeared in the doorway of the communications tent with Yithrin behind her. Her coveralls were torn and she had burns on her hands, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "The hybrid weapons are ready," she said. "We have modified 6 Velari fighters and armed them with everything from human missiles to alien energy weapons. They will not last long against a full Devourer fleet, but they will give those mechanical bastards something to think about." Jake smiled and looked around at the faces of humans and Velari who had spent the last week learning to work together. "Then I guess it is time to see if our new partnership can survive its first real test." Outside the tent, the sun was setting over the settlement where 2 species had learned to call each other family. Tomorrow would bring war, but tonight there was hope. The Devourer fleet appeared at dawn like a nightmare made of metal and mathematics. Jake stood on the watchtower and counted 47 ships, each one the size of a city block. They hung in the sky with perfect geometric precision and made no sound except for a low humming that seemed to come from inside his bones. Amy stood beside him, holding a radio that crackled with voices, speaking in both human languages and Velari music. The hybrid defense fleet consisted of 6 modified fighters and 2 human aircraft that had been armed with Velari weapons. It was not much to face an armada, but it was what they had. "All units, this is Commander Morrison," Jake spoke into the radio. "Remember the plan. Hit and run. Make them chase you. Do not try to fight them head to head." The lead Devourer ship opened like a flower made of steel and broadcast a message that echoed across the settlement. The voice was perfectly clear and completely without emotion. "Biological entities of Sol 3, the machine voice said. "You harbor fugitive specimens designated Velari. Surrender all biological matter for processing or face termination. You have 60 seconds to comply." Jake keyed his radio and spoke words he had been planning for 3 days. "This is Commander Jake Morrison of Earth. We do not surrender. We do not run. And we sure as hell do not let anyone destroy our home." The response was immediate. Energy beams lanced down from the Devourer ships and struck the settlement's outer defenses. The shields that Amy and Yithrin had built from human generators and Velari crystals flared to life and held for exactly 4 seconds before overloading in showers of sparks. "All fighters engage," Jake called out. "Show them what humans and Velari can do together." Captain Steve Rodriguez piloted the lead fighter with War Chief Keffel as his gunner. The ship moved with human unpredictability and Velari grace as it dove toward the nearest Devourer vessel. Energy bolts and human missiles struck the mechanical ship's hull and left scars on its perfect surface. "First blood to us," Steve called over the radio. "These things bleed electricity." The Devourer ship turned to pursue Steve's fighter with movements that were mathematically perfect but predictable. Steve had been flying helicopters in combat for 15 years, and he knew how to make impossible things happen with machinery that should not work. Amy's voice crackled through the radio. "Steve, break left now." Steve threw his fighter into a turn that should have torn the wings off, but the hybrid human Velari construction held together. The Devourer's return fire passed through empty space while Steve lined up for another attack. "Run." On the ground, Carl Bennett triggered the first surprise he had built into the settlement's defenses. What looked like abandoned buildings opened to reveal missile launchers constructed from spare parts and Velari power cores. Dozens of projectiles streaked toward the Devourer fleet, trailing fire and human stubbornness. The mechanical ships moved to intercept the missiles with point defense systems that calculated trajectories with perfect accuracy. What they did not calculate was that Carl had built the missiles to change course randomly using guidance systems salvaged from old video games. 3 Devourer ships took hits and began trailing debris that sparkled like broken stars. The mechanical fleet responded by launching landing craft filled with robotic soldiers that moved with the same geometric precision as their ship. Jake left the watchtower and ran toward the settlement center where Dr. Park had set up a field hospital. Humans and Velari worked together to move wounded to safety while overhead the battle filled the sky with light and thunder. "How are we doing?" Dr. Park asked as she bandaged the human pilot who had crash-landed his damaged fighter. "We are still alive," Jake replied. "That counts as winning for now." Ryan Torres burst into the hospital tent carrying his radio equipment. "Commander, I have been monitoring their communications," he said. "The Devourers are confused. Their tactical computers cannot predict our movements. Because we keep doing things that do not make sense," Jake grinned. "Good. Confusion is our best weapon. Outside the tent, Velari warriors fought alongside human soldiers against waves of mechanical troops. The robots moved in perfect formation and fired with deadly accuracy, but they could not adapt. When Kefil used human tactics to flank them, or when human marines used Velari energy shields to close the distance, Amy's voice came over the radio. "Again, Jake, we have a problem. More Devourer ships are entering the atmosphere. I count 20 additional vessels." Jake looked up through the tent opening and saw the new ships descending like metal rain. Each one carried enough firepower to level the settlement, but they were landing in patterns that made no tactical sense. "They are trying to surround us," Kefil reported. "Standard Devourer doctrine for planetary cleansing operations." "Standard doctrine," Jake repeated and felt an idea forming. "Ryan, can you broadcast on their command frequency?" "Already set up," Ryan replied. "What do you want to tell them?" Jake took the microphone and spoke to machines that had consumed 1,000 worlds. "Attention, Devourer fleet. This is Human Tactical Command. We know you can hear this. We know you are listening to our communications and trying to understand our strategy." The radio was silent for a moment. Then the mechanical voice responded. "Human tactical patterns are inefficient and illogical. Victory is statistically impossible for your forces. That is what I was hoping you would say," Jake replied. "Amy, execute Plan Chaos. Every human in Velari." Fighters suddenly broke formation and began attacking random targets with no coordination or tactical sense. Missiles fired at empty space while energy weapons targeted rocks and trees. The settlement's defenders appeared to panic and began running in all directions. Devourer fleet responded by moving their ships to optimal firing positions, based on human military doctrine that Jake had fed them through carefully leaked communications. They were preparing to end the battle with overwhelming firepower, applied at precisely the right moment. What they did not know was that every chaotic movement had been planned and every random target had been chosen for a reason. When Amy triggered the second phase of Plan Chaos, the settlement's real defenses came online. Hidden energy cannons built into the landscape opened fire at point-blank range. Mines disguised as rocks detonated under landing craft. The atmospheric processors that had cleaned Earth's air revealed their true purpose as weapons that turned the planet's atmosphere into a conductor for massive electrical discharges. 6. Devourer ships fell from the sky in flames while others began emergency ascent to escape the trap that Earth had become. For the first time in their machine existence, they had encountered an enemy that fought without logic or predictable patterns. War Chief Kefil stood in the settlement square with his energy weapon glowing and his pale blue skin marked with soot from battle. Around him, human and Velari warriors cheered as burning Devourer ships crashed into the wasteland beyond the walls. "I understand now," he called out to Jake. "Hope is not about winning. Hope is about refusing to lose." Jake looked up at the sky, where the remaining Devourer ships were retreating toward space. The battle was not over, but for the first time in centuries, someone had made the mechanical hunters afraid. "That is just the beginning," Jake said. "Now we teach the galaxy how to fight back." 6 months after the battle, the settlement had grown into something that could only be called a city. Buildings made of human metal and Velari. Crystals stretched across the valley, while ships from a dozen different worlds landed daily at the spaceport that Amy had built from airplane runways and alien technology. Jake stood in his new office, which was still made from shipping containers, because some things should not change. Through the window, he could see human children playing with young, Valarian gardens where earth plants grew alongside flowers from distant stars. The air was clean, and the water ran clear, and the radiation counters had stopped clicking entirely high. Commander Zethara entered carrying a data tablet that displayed a map of the galaxy. Red dots marked worlds that had been consumed by the Devourers, while green dots showed planets that had been liberated by the growing alliance. There were more green dots every day. The fleet from Proxima Centauri has arrived, she said. They brought 300 refugees and a request for training in human tactical doctrine. Jake nodded and looked at the map. How many does that make? 47 different species, Zethara replied. All seeking to learn the art of fighting without fear. Amy knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Her coveralls were cleaner now, and she wore the insignia of Chief Technology Officer, but she still carried tools in her pockets and grease under her fingernails. Behind her came Yithrin, who had learned to walk with the confident stride of an engineer who could fix anything. The new hybrid fighters are ready for deployment, Amy said. We have combined defensive systems from 8 different species with human weapons and Valari power sources. The Devourers will not know what hit them. Literally, Yithrin added with what might have been humor. Human unpredictability combined with alien. Technology creates weapons that cannot be calculated or predicted. Dr. Lisa Park appeared in the doorway, carrying a medical scanner and wearing the tired but satisfied expression of someone who had been saving lives all day. The trauma counseling program is showing remarkable results, she said. Species that have been running for centuries are learning to stand and fight. Courage really is contagious. Jake looked at his friends and felt pride that had nothing to do with military victories. They had built something new here where 2 dying peoples had learned to make each other stronger. The settlement that had barely survived was now the capital of a growing confederation that stretched across the stars. Ryan Torres burst into the room carrying his radio equipment and grinning like he had won the lottery. Commander, you need to hear this, he said. I just intercepted a transmission from the far edge of the galaxy. He set up his equipment and tuned to a frequency that crackled with static and distance. Through the noise came a voice speaking in a language that the translation computers did not recognize. This is Science Vessel Bright Hope calling Earth Alliance, the voice said. We have been monitoring your broadcast and request assistance against Devourer forces in our sector. We offer alliance and shared technology in exchange for training. In human fighting methods, Jake looked around the room at faces that reflected his own amazement. How far away are they? 6 months' journey at maximum speed, Ryan replied. They are willing to make the trip if we are willing to help them. War Chief Keffel entered the room carrying weapons that gleamed with both human pragmatism and Valari artistry. His pale blue skin bore scars from the battle 6 months ago, but his eyes held something they had not held before. They held hope. The training exercises are complete, he reported. Human Marines and Valari warriors now fight as one force. The refugee species are learning quickly, though some still struggle with the concept of attacking. Instead of defending, Jake stood and walked to the window where he could see the spaceport busy with activity. Ships were being loaded with supplies and weapons while crews from a dozen worlds prepared for missions that would have been impossible before humans and Valari learned to work together. Zethara, he said, send a message to Science Vessel Bright Hope. Tell them the Earth Alliance accepts their request for mutual aid. We will teach them to fight, and they will teach us their technology. And tell them something else, Jake continued. Tell them that no one fights alone anymore. Amy was already making notes on her tablet. I will need to design new ship configurations for their technology, she said. Human durability with alien capabilities. This is going to be interesting. Dr. Park was reviewing medical data from the refugee populations. We will need expanded trauma treatment programs, she said. Every species that arrives here has been running scared for so long they have forgotten how to hope. Then we teach them, Jake said. The same way the Velari taught us that survival is possible, and we taught them that fighting back is possible. Carl. Bennett appeared in the doorway, covered in oil and satisfaction. The new planetary defense grid is online, he reported. Any Devourer fleet that tries to attack Earth will find more surprises than they can calculate. Jake looked at the faces around him and realized that something impossible had happened. The humans who had barely survived on a dying world were now leading a galactic alliance against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The Velari, who had fled across space as refugees, were now teaching other species the technology of hope. There is something I want to add to our next broadcast, Jake. Side. Something for any species out there that is still running and hiding. Ryan adjusted his equipment to broadcast on all frequencies across the galaxy. Jake took the microphone and spoke words that would be heard on 1,000 worlds. This is Commander Jake Morrison of the Earth Alliance, he said. To any beings who are listening and afraid. To any peoples who have lost their worlds to the Devourers. To anyone who thinks the fight is hopeless. We are here and we are waiting for you. The Velari came to Earth thinking they would save a dying world, Jake continued. Instead, we saved each other. We learned that no one is too weak to fight, and no one is too strong to need help. We learned that courage shared becomes hope, and hope shared becomes victory. Come to Earth, Jake said. Bring your knowledge and your wounded and your fear. We will teach you to fight, and you will teach us to be better. Together we will take back the galaxy one world at a time. Jake set down the microphone and looked out the window where human and alien children were playing games that had never existed before. The sun was setting over a world that had been dying when he was born, but was now more alive than it had ever been. Zethar approached and stood beside him at the window. Do you think we can really defeat the Devourers? She asked. Jake smiled and watched a human girl teaching a young Velari how to throw a baseball while a creature from Proxima Centauri tried to understand the rules. I think we already have, he said. We just need to let the rest of the galaxy know. Outside the window, the stars were coming out, and among them, new ships were already heading toward Earth, carrying beings who had learned that somewhere in the darkness there was still light. The Velari had come to save humanity, but humanity had ended up saving them all. And this was only the beginning.